His name is Pete Drake. He got the brilliant idea one time to make his steel guitar talk, and he actually does it right now with a beautiful song, Forever. Pete Drake!
Well, if there was ever a name that divided steel guitar fans, it might actually be Pete Drake. He was the most recorded steel guitarist in history, and he once released an album that he titled The Greatest Steel Guitarist in the World. And he was really like an active person in the music industry. So he had a lot of connections, and he's going to use a lot of those contacts to take the steel guitar places that it really hadn't ever been before. He was also an inventor. And we're going to see in this video more about that invention you saw at the intro called the talking steel guitar. Pete Drake was born in Augusta, Georgia, 1932. He passed away in 1988 in Nashville. So he was just 56 years old when he died, meaning that he had one of the most illustrious careers in like the shortest amount of time possible. And you know, Pete Drake is really probably the steel guitarist that most people listening to country music have heard more than any other steel guitarist, whether they know it or not. And he accomplishes all of this not by being the fastest, most technical player, but really actually playing the simplest steel guitar. And for that reason, his memory isn't really cherished in the same way that a lot of the other fabulous steel players are remembered and loved. What Pete didn't do with his hands, he made up for with his creativity, his inventions, and really with his feet in his use of the volume pedal, and also the work he did with his left foot on the pedals of the steel guitar. So let's start by looking at the life and career of Pete Drake from a biographical perspective. Pete was born in Augusta, Georgia. As I said, he was the son of a Pentecostal preacher. In the 1950s, he drove to Nashville with his brothers. The name Jack Drake is a name that a lot of people are going to be familiar with. He was quite a well-known bassist that played with Ernest Tubb for many years. And interestingly enough, it's Jerry Byrd, who is the steel guitarist that Pete hears and sees at the Grand Ole Opry, who inspires him to want to become a steel guitarist. So in 1959, he moves to Nashville, and within just a few years, he's going to become one of the key members of the Nashville A-Team, the studio musicians that were a pretty tight core with some fluctuating members that played on just so much legendary country music and even country folk. Pete made a really big contribution to non-country music, which is something that does set him apart from a lot of the other steel guitarists in this series. Not all of them, but most of them. Especially when you consider that Pete played and recorded with Bob Dylan, Elvis Presley, and members of the Beatles. I mean, that really puts him in a kind of elite stratosphere that not a lot of other steel guitarists are ever going to get to. And he did have a surprisingly short life. He died of emphysema in '88, and his brother Jack Drake also died young. They both died of emphysema. And by the end of this video, when you see how much Pete Drake accomplished, you're probably going to be pretty surprised that he was able to do it all that long of a career that he had, considering he's only 56. He was inducted into the Musicians Hall of Fame and Museum in 2007, and he was the first steel guitarist inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. He was also inducted into the Steel Guitar Hall of Fame. He was also probably one of the most lucrative steel guitarists, especially when combined with all of the producing, industry work, writing, managing, and everything else that he did. When you put it all in one book of accounting, I'm sure that he had a career financially that other steel guitarists would have been really happy to have. He was a very versatile steel guitarist, perhaps so because he played on such a wide variety of genres, outside of country. So Pete definitely had a huge impact on the world of steel guitar as we know it. One of the components that fascinates me the most is what was the it factor that had him playing on all of those sessions, especially the non-country stuff, because we know he wasn't really the most technical player. So how did he get to where he got despite of that? And I think that one of the key elements might have been something I picked up on in a quote about him that said he was one of the kindest and most nurturing figures in Nashville by all accounts. So I suspect there's something that people who were there know about Pete and his personality and his energy in the studio. Some people just really are just tremendous in the studio. They have this great energy about them. They're very creative. They work well with others. And sometimes people who are the most talented are also some of the most difficult to work with. And what was Pete's signature style, his trademark sound, as compared to Jerry Bird and Buddy Emmons, who had pretty distinct styles? Pete had a very atmospheric kind of playing. He liked to use effects. There were recordings of him without effects, but he really leaned into the effects. He's been described as being sort of a master of tone, which is something that is a very subtle and nuanced thing that is actually very technically difficult to accomplish, but it's not the type of thing that really wows the listener. It's really something more that you feel. The steel guitar generally has the ability to cut through the music. If you think about Don Helms and that steel guitar just cutting through Hank Williams' music, well, the way that Pete played was actually the opposite of that. It was his ability to melt into the song. And that's an ability that he evolved in the progression of his career. So by the 1970s, he was so good at that understated style, it became one of the most in-demand steel guitarists. I mean, he's the guy that really could make the steel guitar cry. If anyone could make it cry, it was definitely Pete Drake. For me personally, in my own opinion, when I think of Pete Drake's playing, I kind of think of it as sort of a simplified and uncomplicated Bakersfield style. That's what I hear when I listen to him. And you add in the effects, you add a lot of reverb, a lot of pedal action, and sometimes he'd have the ability to make you forget that he was even there on the track. He really was kind of a magician in that way. If you want to hear a good example of Pete playing without effects and him playing like a very pure Nashville style of country, there is an album by Hank Locklin that's called, I think it's called Hank Locklin Sings Eddie Arnold. And that album is very different from a lot of Pete Drake's later work. So it's one that you might check out if you're interested to hear him play that more traditional style of pedal steel. I actually found what I think is kind of a cool comment on the Steel Guitar Forum from a guy named Jeff Harbert, which he posted in 2018, and he says, Pete's playing is a fine example of the fact that when all is said and done, what matters most is how much the listener enjoys the sound coming from your amp. Ralph Mooney is another good example. Those guys didn't concern themselves with technical details. They just heard the song and gave it what it needed. As a result, they each have an unmistakable style. Wow, Jeff Harbert is his name. It was really well put, actually. So let's start by looking at the instrumental albums that Pete Drake put out. About 9 albums, and they were all released in the 1960s. They came out on Starday Records. This is the Starday Records shirt in honor of Pete Drake today. And also the Smash label. Of the 9 solo records he puts out, 7 of them are him doing the talking steel. He did have that big song Forever, and a few others were interesting, but the gimmick doesn't really age all that well. It's really a sound that is, like, it's not really music that I want to listen to. I would be absolutely shocked if someone wrote in the comments and said, my favorite steel guitar albums of all time are the Talking Steel records of Pete Drake. I would fall off my chair if I saw that in the comments. The only Pete Drake record that I've got, this one's called Talking Steel and Singing Strings. His biggest one was one with a green cover. It looks somewhat similar to this. It's called Forever. That was the big song. That was the big hit that Pete Drake had on this Talking Steel. So if you want to hear the 2 albums that he actually plays traditional steel on, first one is going to be this album here called The Fabulous Steel Guitar Sound of Pete Drake. That's 1962. That is probably the better of the 2 albums to check out. It's on Starday, everybody's favorite country label. There's some pretty good tracks on here for sure. The second album that he comes out with is called Country Steel Guitar, of him playing non-talking steel pedal steel guitar. That one came out in 1964. And as I said, he only recorded the albums here in this decade, the 60s. He set aside a few records out of my collection that have Pete playing on them. Pete Drake played on a lot of Tom T. Hall records. Tom T. Hall stuff has probably more dobro in it than pedal steel. And Jerry Kennedy played dobro on a lot of this stuff too. Pete had a pretty close relationship with Vernon Oxford. Boy, oh boy, we haven't got into Vernon Oxford on this channel yet, but that is going to be a lot of fun. Lloyd Green and who was the other one? Was it Weldon Myrick, I think, were the other two players. I don't know which ones these are Pete and which ones are the others. And to be honest, my ear for that isn't going to be as good as some of you watching this. So I can't say for sure what tracks Pete played on. So I won't sample any of that. It's the David Allan Coe record. Don't think Pete's playing on this one, but Pete played on a lot of David Allan Coe records. I believe he was either a publisher for David Allan Coe or he might have even managed him at one point. He played on a lot of David Allan Coe records. It's actually kind of surprising, really. I don't kind of picture Pete Drake and David Allan Coe together is they're kind of a funny combo, but Borderlord, Christofferson. This is one record that he plays on, but I think there are many other, there are better records. Those are just some that I thought I'd show them to you. This is a very incomplete list of highlights of the session work that Pete did. So he played on a lot of Johnny Paycheck stuff, Kenny Rogers, David Allan Coe, as I mentioned, Jerry Lee Lewis, George Jones, Dolly Parton, Bob Dylan, Tammy Wynette, Liz Anderson was another one. There's a record, Tracy Nelson, called Mother Earth. I know a lot of people really love that record. There's some of the Hank Lachlan records. There's one called That's How Much I Love You, as well as the Eddie Arnold tribute album. One of the big songs that Pete played on was He Stopped Loving Her Today. The first thing that comes to your mind when you think of that song is probably not the steel guitar, but that is Pete playing on it. Tammy Wynette played on some of the big tracks, Stand By Your Man, amongst others. Lay Lady Lay by Dylan is one of the biggest songs in the catalog that Pete is featured on. One of the video clips that I saw is him talking about playing on this Dylan record.
Lay Lady Lay, that's the old Bob Dylan thing. And,
my favorite, personal favorite, She Thinks I Still Care by Hank Wilson. That is Leon Russell, his country alter ego. That is really, really up there for me. Slide Off Your Satin Sheets by Johnny Paycheck and Blanket on the Ground by Billy Joe Spears. That is one of my all-time favorite steel guitar parts, is in that song. A good friend of mine back in New Brunswick, Canada, has been pressuring me into listening to this Jim Reeves record called Good and Country. And I will concede that that is a pretty good record, even though I'm not a big Jim Reeves fan. Little Dime is a track. Some really nice steel guitar on it. So how is Pete Drake remembered, and how will he be remembered in the future? Well, one of the first things that comes to mind is him being the inventor. The talk box, later so many guitarists ended up using, inspired a lot of guitarists, Peter Frampton and many others. But also his inventions sitting at the steel guitar, his ability to kind of go unnoticed at times and really melt into the song and kind of almost disappear is actually something that, on the occasion that people remember Pete Drake, they might be thinking about. And a really big part of Pete's story is Pete in the music industry, his work even outside of the steel guitar, how much he accomplished. He is just one of the big names in country music in the 1950s, 60s, and 1970s. He played a big part in the story of the best music in the world, honky-tonk, country western, the good old kind of country music. Pete Drake is a name that you've got to know. If they ever end up reopening the Ernest Tubbs record shop on Lower Broadway, I hope they still have Pete's guitar sitting there with his boots, I believe. It's in sort of like a glass case. Really iconic. Country Music Hall of Fame as well, just a few blocks over from Broadway. So if you enjoyed this video, comments what you think about Pete Drake, what your favorite song is with Pete Drake playing on it. I'm sure there's many that I didn't mention here that you're probably chomping at the bit to put in the comments. So if you are, go for it. And I would actually love to know more about who Pete Drake was as a person. So if anybody knows, remembers, met him, knows the story of who he was behind the scenes and how loved he was or wasn't, do let me know in the comments as well if you can about that. And keep on coming back, keep it country, and we'll see you next time.